Welcome to the deep dive. You know, when you grab a quick burger or pick up a box of cereal, it feels, well, easy, cheap, convenient. That's the American meal, right? But today, we're really going to pull back the curtain on that whole idea. Our mission is to look past the price you pay at the counter and dig into the, frankly, staggering costs hidden behind that illusion of cheapness.
Yeah.
We're not talking about the menu today. We're deconstructing the machine, the industrial machine that makes it all possible.
It really is a paradox, isn't it? That super simple, fast food transaction feels so straightforward, so cheap. But when you dive into the sources like we have, you find the actual price has been, well, discounted heavily by pushing the real costs onto others, often the most vulnerable people or the environment itself. We're talking massive debts, labor exploitation, geopolitical messes, huge environmental damage, and honestly, catastrophic public health outcomes.
Exactly. So for those of you listening who like to get right to the foundational stuff, those aha moments, today is pretty critical. We're drilling down into the policies, the industrial thinking, the standardization that built this whole system. And it's important to remember the big breakthroughs here. They weren't culinary. It wasn't about a tastier burger.
No, not at all.
It was logistical. It was about standardizing supply chains, standardizing labor, all to drive down that sticker price, even if it meant sacrificing, long-term integrity, sustainability.
Right. The food revolution wasn't led by chefs. It was led by efficiency engineers. That's the core truth, really. The biggest innovation of modern industrial food. It was creating a supply system so perfectly rationalized, so standardized, that the real consequences, the human cost, the ecological cost just disappear. They're externalized, made invisible to us as consumers. We've optimized purely for the dollar cost, and in doing that, we've completely destabilized everything else. Social costs, ecological costs, human costs, it's all out of whack.
Okay, so let's start where the money starts. The policy, the subsidies. Because nothing in this giant system moves without some powerful economic incentives, right? We need to understand how the basic building blocks the corn, the soy that fuel almost everything, how they're engineered to be so artificially cheap.
Yeah, and that really starts with U.S. farm policy, specifically what a lot of our sources call the Wall Street Farm Bill. Now, that's kind of a loaded term, but it points to a shift. This framework, which has been tweaked but essentially rolling since about 1996, it's different from older policies. Older policies sometimes tried to spread support, maybe keep smaller family farms going. This modern version, it's much more focused on commodity trading, market risk management, less about direct farmer support, more about the big players.
So if it's not really about helping the traditional farmer, who is it helping? And how does it make things cheaper?
Overwhelmingly, it benefits the really big agricultural operations. And critically, the giant processing corporations. Think Cargill, ADM, Tyson. The policy heavily subsidizes just a few specific coarse grains, mostly corn and soy. It does this through things like deficiency payments, disaster aid, mechanisms that basically put a floor into production but actually push the market price down.
So the government is basically guaranteeing cheap raw materials for industry, like a safety net for the buyers almost.
Precisely. That's a good way to put it. These huge corporations, what they want is simple. Maximum volume of cheap grain. That's it. So when the Farm Bill creates these incentives that put constant, crushing downward pressure on corn and soy prices, what happens? You get this massive explosion in production. Often it's not even profitable for the farmer growing it, but the processors, they make record profits because they can buy these inputs way below what a truly free market might dictate. And this is what fuels the whole industrial system. It gives you incredibly cheap feed for animals in those concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, and it gives you cheap ingredients like high fructose corn syrup for processed foods. Honestly, without this subsidy structure, the price of a chicken breast, burger, a soda, it would jump.
A lot.
Right.
And that economic engine, built on cheap inputs, it absolutely depends on standardization and scale, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Moving away from diverse food traditions towards something more like the assembly line.
Totally. Think about how we eat meat now in the West. It's incredibly high volume, right? We eat a lot of it. But that huge volume comes from a surprisingly narrow range of animals. Cows, pigs, chickens, mostly. And why those animals? Not necessarily because they're the best tasting or the most, ecologically sound. They were chosen because they are uniquely suited to mass production, to domestication at this extreme industrial scale. They can be bred to grow faster, bigger, more uniform, standardized.
And this idea of meat being an everyday thing, a staple for almost everyone, that's actually really new in human history, isn't it? Which just shows how successful this price-lowering industrial push has been.
Oh, absolutely unprecedented. Economic historians point out that demand for meat is usually very income elastic, meaning when people make more money, they tend to buy more meat. Friedrich Engels actually noted this way back in 1844. He saw that better paid industrial workers could suddenly afford meat daily, while poorer workers only got it maybe a few times a week. So the huge success of the modern food system was taking what used to be a luxury, a treat, and making it an everyday expectation for almost everyone. And they did it purely by driving the cost down through this intense rationalization and standardization.
It's fascinating how that drive for standardization wasn't just about the animals or the crops. It even seeped into, like, our kitchens, the tools we use. You found a really interesting parallel there.
Yeah, it really shows how deep this efficiency mindset went. Take the dinner table knife. Before maybe the 17th century in Europe, if you went to someone's house for dinner, you'd bring your own knife. Sharp, personal, a tool you relied on. But then, as dining got more formal, more impersonal maybe, hosts started providing knives, bought in identical sets dozens at a time, and, crucially, they were dull. The historian Stephen Manell pointed this out. It takes a certain kind of modern politeness, or maybe just a commitment to mass production, to actually design a knife that's worse at cutting food.
Huh. A less effective tool, just so everything matches and nobody gets stabbed, I guess.
Exactly. And that loss of the personal tool, it kind of mirrors the loss of connection to where the food comes from. We wanted efficiency, replicability. Think about someone like Fanny Farmer, the cookbook author. She championed measured recipes. Before her, recipes were often vague, a pinch of this, handful of that, relied on intuition. Farmer standardized measurements, level teaspoons, cups. It simplified mass feeding, guaranteed the same result every time. That's standardization right down to the kitchen counter.
But that's standardization. And this relentless hunt for cheaper and cheaper commodity inputs, it casts a huge global shadow. Which brings us to the geopolitical cost. This need for predictable, cheap supply chains often leads to really ugly clashes. Foreign companies versus local governments. The United Fruit Company in Guatemala is just a textbook example, isn't it?
It's the textbook case. It shows corporate power, driven by the demand for cheap food in this case, bananas clashing directly with national sovereignty. You had the democratically elected Arbenz government in Guatemala trying to enact some progressive land reform, applying their own labor code, trying to reclaim large areas of land owned by United Fruit, much of which wasn't even being used. For Arbenz, this was about social justice, national development. For United Fruit, it was an attack, a direct threat to their land, their predictable supply, their profits. Intolerable.
And when those corporate interests clashed with democratic reform, the U.S. government stepped in. On the side of the corporation, how did that happen?
It was a CIA-backed coup, plain and simple, called Operation Success, orchestrated in 1954. Arbenz himself said it publicly. Guatemala's attempts at social and economic progress were running headlong into the interests of these great foreign consortiums based in the U.S. So, to protect United Fruit's land and business model, the U.S. government engineered the overthrow of a sovereign elected government. The real price of cheap bananas: political destabilization, intervention.
That's staggering. How did they sell that back home to the American public?
Oh, through a massive propaganda campaign. They brought in the big guns. Edward Bernays is often called the father of public relations. He helped paint the Arbenz government as communistic, especially after the land reform stuff started. It created this huge wave of negative press, all favoring United Fruit. It manufactured consent, basically, made the American public see it as fighting communism, not protecting corporate assets. People had no idea about the brutal political price being paid elsewhere so their fruit bowls could stay full and cheap. It shows that the cost of cheap food is often measured in, well, blood and political chaos.
Okay, so we have the geopolitical price as one major hidden debt. The second has to be the human cost, the actual labor needed to keep this standardized, high-volume, low-cost machine humming. When you read the descriptions in the sources about conditions inside these CAFOs, these concentrated animal feeding operations, they're just horrific. Places called brutal flesh pits.
The language is harsh, but it reflects the reality. The whole success of this industrial food system is tied directly to its reliance on a workforce that's high turnover, low skilled, often recent immigrants, vulnerable people, people whose labor can be bought cheaply and treated as, well, interchangeable parts. The system is designed for minimal training. It reflects that core industrial idea. Reduce the worker to just a cog in the machine, speed over skill.
And you see that most clearly, most brutally in the slaughter process itself, right? Where the sheer volume and the speed are just overwhelming.
Exactly. Take the poultry industry. The sources paint a really grim picture. Birds crammed into crates. Then, in this process built only for speed, they're grabbed often by the, quote, least skilled of the workers, passed upside down to other workers who cut their throats. And in many, many cases, this happens without any stunning beforehand.
And skipping the stunning, which is meant to reduce suffering, that's purely an economic choice, isn't it? What's the pressure that leads to that specific compromise?
It really boils down to hyper-competition, pennies per pound. In that kind of market, the time it takes to properly stun an animal, that's seen as a cost, an inefficiency. So sacrificing humane standards becomes a necessary cost-cutting measure to stay competitive. Even farms that want to maintain high standards can get squeezed by the economics of the commodity market. When animals are treated purely as units of production, their welfare inevitably conflicts with the bottom line. Skipping the stun saves maybe seconds per bird, but that adds up to thousands of dollars a day across a massive plant. It's that brutal economic logic forcing these ethical compromises at the most vulnerable point, the point of slaughter.
It's worth pausing here to realize this kind of exploitation, using vulnerable labor for essential food resources. It feels very modern, very industrial, but the principle is ancient.
It's a really critical historical echo, yeah. If you go way back thousands of years, look at how salt was produced. Salt was absolutely fundamental for preserving food, for survival itself, and the labor, just as coercive. We have records from ancient Valea describing salt production, hoisting heavy brine buckets all day long. And how was it done? Human power, often slaves or prisoners. 2 men chained together at the neck, walking inside a giant wheel, 2 more chained outside, turning the whole mechanism.
Wow. So whether it's salt in ancient Rome or a cheap chicken nugget today, the pattern is similar. Getting essential food resources is often relied on treating human beings as expendable, interchangeable engines. Coerced efficiency.
That's the sobering parallel. The low-wage, high-turnover, often dangerous work in modern meatpacking plants. It's a modern version of that same historical pattern. Workers get dehumanized, their safety is compromised for speed and volume, simply because their cheap labor is essential to maintaining this whole illusion of affordable food. The real social price is paid by the person on that disassembly line.
And it's not just the workers inside the plants who pay a price. The system also seems to be devastating the traditional American farmer, the person who, actually raised the animal or grew the crop in the first place.
That's one of the most painful ironies, isn't it? The triumph of this huge consolidated industrial system has come at the direct expense of the small, independent family farmer, often people whose families have worked that land for generations. The statistics are just brutal. We saw farm bankruptcies spike dramatically, up 24% in just 1 year around late 2019, reaching levels not seen in almost a decade. This isn't just a bad year, it's a kind of cultural wipeout.
How does the pressure of this modern commodity system crush them? It seems strange that a country producing so much food can't support its own farmers.
They get caught in this terrible squeeze. They're totally dependent on these massive, volatile, global commodity markets where they have zero leverage, zero control. Look at the dairy industry, for example. There was that boom in Greek yogurt consumption for a few years, right?
Right, yeah.
So a lot of dairy farms invested heavily, expanded their herds, took on significant debt, assuming that demand would just keep going up. But then demand leveled off. And at the same time, global milk production surged, especially from really efficient producers in places like Europe and New Zealand. So prices crashed everywhere. And those American farms, stuck with big herds and big debts, they faced a stark choice. Somehow get bigger, take on even more unsustainable debt to compete on volume, or just get out, sell the farm.
And the cost isn't just financial, is it? It's emotional, cultural. It hollows out communities.
Exactly. When a farmer is forced to sell their herd, forced to liquidate, they're not just losing a business, they're losing their home, their connection to the community, their family heritage. Their whole way of life is just gone. You hear stories, the despair is just palpable. This relentless pressure to consolidate the get big or get out mentality, it has hollowed out so much of rural America. Power gets concentrated in the hands of a few giant corporations while the people actually working the land get pushed to the margins.
Okay, so we've got economic distortion, we've got human exploitation. The third huge hidden cost has got to be the environmental bill.
Yeah.
And it sounds like it's astronomical. When you centralize animal production like this, cramming thousands of animals together, you inevitably concentrate their waste. You create these massive pollution hotspots.
The sheer scale of the waste from these CAFOs, these concentrated animal feeding operations, it's almost impossible to really picture. The sources talk about literal manure mountains. In the U.S. alone, these facilities produce something like 300 million tons of manure every single year.
300 million tons.
Yeah. To put that in perspective, it's orders of magnitude more waste than the entire human population of New York City produces annually. It's just a staggering amount.
Because it's all concentrated in one place, not spread out nationally like on traditional pastures, the local environment just can't handle it, right? It gets overwhelmed.
Precisely. All that concentrated animal waste, often stored in massive lagoons, plus the runoff from heavily fertilized fields growing feed, it becomes a huge source of pollution, especially nitrogen and phosphorus. And the problem gets amplified because historically, agribusiness has often gotten exemptions from environmental rules that other industries have to follow, like the Clean Water Act. They often don't face the same strict limits on discharging waste. So huge amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus just flow relatively unchecked into rivers, streams, groundwater.
And the most visible and maybe most tragic result of all that nitrogen runoff are these infamous dead zones in coastal waters. The Gulf of Mexico is the poster child for this, isn't it?
It is. The Gulf of Mexico dead zone is probably the most stark, large-scale ecological disaster directly linked to industrial agriculture practices happening hundreds of miles upstream. It's an area of hypoxia, meaning the oxygen levels in the water get so low that most marine life just can't survive. And it's gotten huge. At its peak, it's been measured as larger than the entire state of New Jersey.
Bigger than New Jersey. Effectively dead because
Yeah.
of farming practices way up the Mississippi. Can you quickly explain the science? How does the runoff cause this?
Sure. It's a process called eutrophication. All that excess nitrogen and phosphorus flows down the Mississippi River and into the Gulf. This acts like a massive dose of fertilizer for algae in the Gulf water, causing these huge algal blooms. Then, when all that algae dies, it sinks to the bottom. And the bacteria that decompose the dead algae, they consume oxygen, lots of it. They basically suck all the dissolved oxygen out of the water near the bottom. So anything that can't swim away fast enough, shellfish, crabs, bottom-dwelling fish, they suffocate. And the source breakdown is pretty damning. Studies show about 56% of that nitrogen comes from chemical fertilizer runoff, and another 25% comes directly from animal manure runoff.
And you mentioned this isn't just the Gulf. This isn't a one-off problem.
No, far from it. This industrial model, because it's been exported globally, has created similar problems worldwide. There's something like 146 documented dead zones like this around the globe, and 43 of those are right here in U.S. coastal waters. And we haven't even touched on the antibiotics issue yet. About 70% of all antibiotics produced in the U.S. are used in livestock farming, not for treating sick animals usually, but often just routinely to promote growth or prevent diseases in crowded conditions. This raises huge concerns about antibiotic resistance, creating superbugs that could impact human health. It's another ticking time bomb directly tied to the supposed efficiency of the factory farm model.
Now, when the industry faces criticism for all this, the pollution, the dead zones, the antibiotics, they always seem to fall back on one main argument,
Yeah.
that we need this large-scale industrial system to feed the world. That's a moral imperative, basically.
Ah, yes, the 9 billion hungry mouths argument. You hear it constantly. It's a very powerful narrative, often used as a political shield by agribusiness to push back against regulation, to justify the status quo. But when you look at the actual numbers, the argument doesn't really hold water. The current global agricultural system already produces enough food calories, an estimated 4,600 calories per person per day on Earth.
Wait, 4,600 calories. That's like twice what most people actually need to thrive.
Exactly, twice what's needed. So the problem isn't fundamentally about production volume. It's about distribution. It's about waste. It's about political and economic systems that prioritize producing cheap commodities for profit over actually ensuring everyone gets nutritious food or protecting the environment. The idea that we need polluting factory farms and massive monocultures to feed the world, it's largely a myth, a very convenient myth for the corporations that profit from that exact system.
Okay, so if the industrial model is so damaging and maybe not even necessary for sheer volume, what about alternatives? Do the sources point towards ways of farming that are actually, well, better, more
Yeah,
sustainable?
Absolutely. There's a growing movement around what's often called regenerative agriculture. It offers a fundamentally different approach, one focused on ecological health, on conviviality with nature, rather than just extraction. While the industrial model tries to simplify everything monocrops, specialized inputs regenerative farming focuses on complexity, on building healthy soil. Practices like holistic planned grazing are key here. Instead of keeping animals packed together, it involves moving livestock frequently, mimicking how wild herds move across grasslands.
And what does that actually do for the land? How does moving them help?
It allows the pasture time to rest and recover after being grazed. The animal impact the manure, the hoof action, actually helps build up organic matter in the soil when it's managed properly. It increases the soil's ability to hold water to sequester carbon from the atmosphere. The core insight is that healthy ecosystems, especially grasslands, thrive on this combination. Herbivores, diverse perennial plants, periods of rest, and periodic disturbance. It's how nature builds soil. Farmers who transition to these methods often find their costs for things like synthetic fertilizers and pesticides drop dramatically over time. It shows that working with the ecosystem can actually eliminate the need for many of the polluting inputs that define the industrial model. It's a completely different paradigm.
Okay, we've covered the economic distortions, the human labor costs, the ecological ruin. The fourth, and maybe the most direct cost of this whole industrial food system, that's the one paid by us, the consumers, directly, in the form of a massive public health crisis.
It is, without a doubt, the highest price we pay collectively. I mean, the diet that this super efficient, standardized system churns out food that's cheap, incredibly energy dense, highly processed has directly fueled an epidemic of chronic diseases. In the United States, obesity is now second only to smoking as a preventable cause of death. Think about that.
Wow. Let's put the numbers on that if we can.
Ah.
What's the scale of the human cost here?
Annually, the estimates are around 280,000 Americans dying as a direct result of being overweight or obese. 280,000 people every year. And the financial cost, it's astronomical. The healthcare costs directly linked to obesity are approaching $240 billion a year.
Yeah.
And on top of that, Americans spend another $33 billion or more on weight loss products, diets, surgeries, trying to undo the damage. It's perverse and industry profits from making us sick, and then profits again selling us supposed cures.
What's really terrifying, though, is the impact on kids, on the youngest generation.
It is absolutely heartbreaking. The sources mention documented cases of severely obese American children. Kids as young as 6, 7, up to 10 years old actually dying from heart attacks. Heart attacks caused directly by their weight and the conditions that come with it. This isn't some far-off future problem. It's happening now. It's a direct, immediate, and sometimes fatal consequence of a food environment structured around these cheap, convenient, industrially produced foods.
And yet, when credible science tries to offer basic, sensible advice, maybe eat less processed stuff, more vegetables, it seems to crash headlong into the political power of the very industry profiting from the status quo. This is where it gets really insidious, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The process for creating national dietary guidelines, for example, is often deeply influenced, if not outright corrupted, by political pressure from the food industry. The simple truth is any official advice that says eat less of something, especially highly profitable things like sugar, processed fats, meat, is seen as a direct threat to the industry's bottom line. And that triggers immediate, intense lobbying, opposition campaigns, questioning the science, everything.
Can you give us an example? That whole scandal with the original food guide pyramid in the early 90s comes to mind.
That's the classic case study, perfect example. In 1991, the USDA had developed the first food guide pyramid. It was designed, printed, ready to go out as the main visual for American dietary advice. And then, almost overnight, the USDA pulled it, withdrew it completely. Why? Because of intense coordinated protests and lobbying, primarily from the meat and dairy industries. They hated how their products looked on the pyramid, the recommended servings. They thought as bad for business.
So the government agency, supposedly in charge of nutritional guidance, literally shelved its own advice because industry complained.
That's exactly what happened. It was so blatant, the press jumped all over it. Headlines like, "Are cattlemen now guarding the hen house?" It perfectly captured the situation. These industries fight ferociously against any government advice that suggests limiting their products, or maybe, heaven forbid, prioritizing plant-based foods. Public health guidelines are treated as a marketing threat that needs to be neutralized.
And this isn't just a U.S. problem, right? This kind of pressure happens on the global stage, too.
Oh, yeah, it's a global playbook. Remember back in the early 2000s, the World Health Organization, the WHO, proposed a pretty basic public health guideline. Limit added sugars to no more than 10% of daily calories. Seems reasonable, right? But the global sugar industry saw it as an existential threat. And what happened? That 10% recommendation was ultimately removed from the final WHO global strategy document. Why? Because powerful sugar lobbying groups successfully pressured the U.S. government to intervene, to challenge the science, to basically kill the recommendation at the international level. The U.S. government acted on behalf of a single commodity industry against global public health advice.
So the system sells us food that contributes to making us sick, and then actively fights to make sure the official advice doesn't clearly tell us to eat less of it. It puts all the responsibility back on the individual, doesn't it? To somehow figure out a healthy path through this minefield.
That's exactly where we end up. And the good news is the power does lie with individual choices. And the science supporting healthier alternatives is incredibly strong. When people shift away from that standard Western industrial diet, the results can be amazing. You have studies from pioneers like Dr. Dean Ornish, Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn. They showed conclusively that a diet based on whole plant foods, what's often called a WFPB diet, couldn't just prevent heart disease, it could actually reverse it in many cases. Severe heart disease reversed with food, and you see it internationally. Populations that still eat traditional diets high in whole plant foods have vastly lower rates of heart disease compared to Americans.
But despite that clear science, there's still this institutional reluctance, this fear about recommending significant changes to the normal American diet.
Exactly. You still hear concerns from established institutions that recommending a whole foods plant-based approach is somehow too radical or maybe expensive, or that it might disrupt normal nutritional balance. But you have to ask yourself, what's so normal about a diet that's contributing to millions dying prematurely from chronic diseases? The cost of not changing the billions in healthcare, the lost lives, the suffering that completely dwarfs any perceived cost or difficulty of eating differently. The focus really needs to shift from tinkering around the edges to embracing the simple power of eating real whole foods, which, ironically, is advice the health and wellness industry struggles to monetize because you can't easily package and sell eat more vegetables.
So wrapping up this deep dive, we've traced the hidden machinery behind the cheap, convenient American meal. And what we found is this terrifying convergence of costs, economic distortions driven by subsidies, human exploitation baked into the labor system, both here and abroad, massive ecological damage, from CAFO pollution to coastal dead zones, and finally, the immense health debt paid by individuals and society, all tangled up in that burger and fries.
And it's crucial to remember the system isn't just inevitable. It's not a natural outcome. It's a machine that requires constant fuel, policy decisions, subsidies, consumer purchases, turning a blind eye. It needs all of that to keep running. And maybe the most stark takeaway from the sources is this. Any plan, any approach that involves continuing to funnel money into the factory farm system, even if it's just sometimes, well, it's not going to end factory farming. We can't treat ethical food choices like, going on strike, but then crossing the picket line whenever it gets inconvenient.
That brings up that interesting, sometimes contentious distinction between someone who is fully vegan or vegetarian versus what's sometimes called the conscientious omnivore.
Yeah, sometimes called the Paris exemption, with a bit of skepticism in some circles. The idea is that vegans and vegetarians draw a very clear, visible line. Their choices are consistent, and that consistency often forces conversations, makes other people think. The conscientious omnivore, who maybe buys pasture-raised eggs sometimes or eats less meat most days, their actions, while well-intentioned, often don't send as clear a signal. They can inadvertently reinforce the status quo view that animals are just resources to be used, albeit maybe nicer resources sometimes. Because, as one source puts it quite bluntly, ham from a pig who led a happy life looks very much like ham from a factory-farmed pig on the dinner plate.
The quiet, occasional ethical choice doesn't really disrupt the underlying industrial model.
Pretty much. To really shift a system, this entrenched, visible commitment, clear intent, probably matters more than silent, intermittent compromises. The whole industrial system thrives on invisibility, making the subsidies invisible, the pollution invisible, the worker suffering invisible, the long-term health costs invisible. If our purchasing power only occasionally supports the alternative while consistently supporting the mainstream, the industrial machine just keeps chugging along. It wins the long game.
So the provocative thought we want to leave you with today is this. Given that this entire incredibly costly system depends on that constant, often invisible flow of money, your money included, what truly visible and consistent changes can you make in your own food choices, in your sphere of influence? How can you use your purchasing power not just quietly, but in a way that forces a system built on hidden costs to actually acknowledge your moral imagination, not just satisfy your immediate appetite? What does that look like for you?